Finally, after all these years, I think I'm actually close to the point of offering my pants for sale. I know. I've said this so many times before, I feel like the boy who cried wolf. Every time I get close, something happens. I learn more, and I keep finding ways to make them better. But I feel even more confident now that the pants are as good as they're ever going to be. And with that, as I near the end, I like to put it on the record how I got here. After so many years, it's getting harder and harder to remember. It started a little over 10 years ago with a very simple idea: pants made right. At the time, I found what was out there over the top, loud, flashy, too skinny, too baggy. There was nothing subtle. It all seemed very much of its time, sort of like bell bottoms and pastel colors of the 70s and 80s. And what was labeled as classic and timeless looked more like costume. It seemed the idea was you either dress up to look rich or like a theater actor rather than to try to look good. Back then, there was very little about the industry on the internet. Instagram, YouTube, and podcasts were not that common. Information was still mostly text. You had to write things and people would read them on blogs, websites, forums. And the few industry professionals really didn't have any of those platforms. That didn't really dissuade me, though, because I knew enough that there was one very famous factory right in my backyard. So I called up Hertling and I asked if I could work with them. They were the gold standard for men's trousers, and they were just made in Brooklyn. I thought it would do quite a bit for my credibility and quality if I could also work with them. The conversation over the phone was very short. I remember they said yes, but I should get a pattern. I had no idea what that was, so I asked some people who would direct me to some other people, and I guess it's a very small world because only so many people make a living making men's trousers in New York City. And by chance, I stumbled upon the pattern maker who worked with Hertling. By that, I mean Hertling in their factory had a number of patterns, and they were all by this one guy. I could tell because his handwriting was on all of them. That was pretty fortuitous. His name was Tony Rubino. And so now I felt pretty confident about working with Hertling. In fact, when I started, I didn't work with Hertling, even though that's where I wanted to end up. I thought it would be a very bad first impression if I knew nothing about what I was doing and started working with them immediately. In hindsight, probably wasn't necessary because Joe and Julie were some very nice guys. Julie Hertling was the owner. Julie was short for Julius, I think. He was quite old, in his 90s, didn't walk too well, but he still showed up to the shop every day. Joe was the manager, and despite ordering sample after sample after sample and never actually even making a single production order with him, he always had a smile on his face. That says a lot because I was probably the most frustrating sort of client to deal with for a factory because I usually ask for samples as opposed to production orders, and for that I'm probably banned from a few factories. And so I started to get a rhythm at this point. I found the right production place, I found the right pattern maker, I had the right team around me, and I could just focus on one thing: perfecting the pattern, perfecting the sample. That said, there was a shaky point in the beginning when I asked Tony for another pattern. This would have been number 3, and it totally threw him in a loop. I learned later the standard process in the industry is making just 2 samples and then going into production. Obviously, I had no idea at the time, and my plan was to just continue iterating until it was right. I think with the 3rd sample, he took that as an affront to his skills because nobody asks for a 3rd pattern, and I did. I had just planned on iterating until everything was just right. I just planned on making patterns until everything was just right. And by requesting a 3rd one, I think he took that as an affront to his skills. That said, we must have gotten along because I think we must have done 30, 40 different patterns by the time we were done. That meant that was probably a sample every month, maybe every 2 months. And for every sample, I'd be making a new pattern with some different ideas. I'd probably even try different fabrics, different weights of fabrics. It was like school to me. I'd be experimenting with everything, reading old tailoring textbooks, bringing in diagrams, trying to wrap my head around every possibility, because I wanted to leave no stone unturned by the time I was done. This went on for some time. In parallel, Julie was getting old, and he sold Hertling to a group of investors. A new guy named Justin was going to run the Hertling business. I actually worked with him longer than I did Joe and Julie, but things definitely changed. And with Joe and Julie in charge, I had the sense nothing was ever going to change. It was going to be the way it was for eternity. That was good because it meant a lot of stability and predictability. But this new group, things got a little less clear. I think in terms of making pants, there was more or less the same, but the personnel changed. The workforce kept shrinking. And I believe Julie had some sort of sweetheart deal with the landlord on the rent. And so when he was gone, so was that deal. And so Hertling actually moved twice, I think. They also started a website and selling directly to customers, and even making women's pants and some other items. Samples would start also taking a little longer than quoted, and so in the back of my head, there were some question marks. Tony, the pattern maker, eventually passed away. I think he was 79. He was semi retired when he was working with me. I think I was one of 3 or 4 clients. He was a great guy. He introduced me to so many people in the industry, all of which I still work with today. One of those was a factory that also made patterns. So eventually I moved all my patterns to them. And this is where things got interesting because by working with a second pattern maker, I got a second set of eyes to edit, audit, and examine things from a different perspective. As we all know, it's so much easier to look at work when it's not your own. There were also a few things Tony never wanted to do on certain patterns, and so with a new pattern maker, I finally got the chance to do certain experiments. Not long after this, there was trouble with Hertling. It was a total disaster, and then I needed a new production factory. And this is where I learned how Hertling was very different from other factories. They were a one-stop shop, a real specialist factory that provided everything for you. In fact, you didn't actually even need a pattern. They had so many stock ones that you could order from, and they had a cutter who could make changes to them on the fly. When marking the fabric, he would just mark up with the adjustments. In retrospect, that seems like a consistency issue to me as a designer who is very particular about things. Now back to the main story. I needed sources for fabric, for trim. Fortunately, I did have one lead, and that was the benefit of showing up to the Hertling factory every month. You would make small talk and learn a couple things. And where I learned where Hertling sourced a number of their fabrics. In working with a salesperson, he seemed to be very empathetic about the whole Hertling situation. I learned much later he actually worked at Hertling. Now, in addition to this, I also needed a new factory. Well, if you look at my video on the experiment with the 8 samples from 8 factories, you'll learn that even though every place says they can make pants, some make it differently than others. Some follow your instructions and some don't. And this was the annoying thing because all these places asked for much more than Hertling ever did, like a tech pack in addition to all the materials. And the frustrating thing is, on the tech pack, I specified certain things that they didn't do. Anyway, that was a huge learning experience, and that's how I got the idea to make that video. And from there, I got to the current factory I'm at, which also makes patterns. And with a third pattern maker, I think we've actually made it even better. And of course, I think there's 1 or 2 adjustments I'd like to make. So we'll see how these experiments turn out. But as I get to this next step, I think I'll be transitioning more to getting my work out there and to explore the idea of connecting with people. That was my idea with the podcast and the videos. And hopefully I'll be able to get my crowdfunding project on Kickstarter operational soon. I know it's going to be challenging. I'm much more of a behind the scenes person. I enjoy the pattern making process and sample making process because you can make mistakes, you can learn, and you can take your time. And success is completely in the realm of your control. And I think in this next phase, a lot of it will be out of my hands. Or so I think. I'm not that educated on the subject, so hopefully I'll be enlightened and maybe even find it enjoyable. Anyway, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to share them with me. Hope this was interesting. Thank you.